Hey everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're taking on a question that popped up on our Daily Bread YouTube channel. And honestly, it really kind of made me stop and think, did God bow to Mary?
It is a question that, at first glance, sounds kind of shocking, doesn't it? But I think, as with so many things in theology, the deeper you go, the more fascinating it gets.
Absolutely, and that's why I knew we had to bring you in on this. Our Daily Bread video, I thought, did a really good job of kind of laying out the different perspectives.
Yeah.
They looked at what the Bible has to say about Mary, and then explored this whole concept of God's humility, and even touched on how various Christian traditions view her.
Yeah, and it's important to start by clarifying that we're not talking about like a literal physical act of bowing here. It's really using that image to get at some deeper theological concepts.
Okay, so not God, like literally getting down on one knee in front of Mary crowned askew. All right, good to clarify.
Yeah.
But if it's not about that, then what is it getting at?
Well, I think it's really a question about power dynamics. When we say bowing, we're talking about submission, right?
Yeah.
About who holds ultimate authority. And in the Christian faith, that authority clearly rests with God.
Right, the video really emphasized God's sovereignty, this idea that he is the ultimate ruler answerable to no one. They even brought up that verse in Philippians about every knee bowing to Jesus. So how does Mary fit into all of that?
Well, and that's where it gets really interesting because as the video pointed out, Mary was chosen by God for this unique and incredibly important role. She was highly favored, as the angel Gabriel tells her in Luke.
Okay, highly favored.
Yeah.
But that doesn't make her equal to God, right?
Exactly. It speaks to her being set apart for this incredible purpose within God's plan. But even being chosen, Mary still exercises her own free will. Her yes to God is this really profound act of obedience and humility. And I think that's really crucial for understanding her role.
I'm starting to see how this all ties back to that initial question about bowing. So if Mary is submitting to God's will, could that be misconstrued as God needing her permission or somehow being beholden to her?
Yeah, you're getting at a really important point, and I think that's precisely why this question is so interesting. It kind of forces us to think more deeply about the nature of God's power, especially as it's revealed through Jesus.
You're so right. The video did bring up this whole idea of God humbling himself through Jesus, especially during the incarnation. I'm thinking of that passage in Philippians about Jesus emptying himself.
Right, and that's where I think we hit this fascinating paradox. On the one hand, we have this very clear affirmation of God's sovereignty, his absolute authority. But then we have God in the person of Jesus willingly entering into the limitations of human existence.
So Jesus being born of Mary, fully human, could that be seen as a kind of humbling?
You're getting right to the heart of it. Some might interpret God's submission to the natural order through birth as a type of humbling. But the video made a really important distinction here. It's not about God bowing to Mary. It's about God's love for us compelling him to take this radical step.
Okay, so it's not about diminishing his power, but about choosing to express it in a way that ultimately leads to our salvation.
Precisely. And this is where understanding the distinction between veneration and worship becomes really important, which our Daily Bread also addressed.
Yeah, they were very clear that honoring Mary, even giving her titles like Mother of God, as some traditions do, is distinct from worshiping her.
Right. It's about recognizing her unique role, but the ultimate object of worship remains God alone. And even within Christianity, there are different approaches to this. Catholic and Orthodox traditions tend to place a higher emphasis on venerating Mary, while Protestant traditions, while acknowledging her blessedness, stress that she remains human, needing grace just like all of us.
And it's interesting because Mary herself never claims any kind of divine status. In fact, in Luke, when she sings the Magnificat, she's praising God's greatness, not her own.
Such a great point. It reinforces this idea that Mary's focus was always directed towards God, and it further complicates this idea of God bowing to her. In choosing Mary, God might be seen as exalting the humble, but not in a way that implies any kind of submission on his part.
So to sum up, theologically speaking, it doesn't really make sense to say that God bowed to Mary, but like you said, the question itself opens up all these other really fascinating avenues for discussion.
Absolutely. It forces us to wrestle with some pretty big concepts: God's sovereignty, human free will, the nature of power, and even how we understand Mary's role. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so compelling.
I totally agree. So for all our listeners out there, hang tight because we're just getting started. In part 2, we're going to dive even deeper into what this all means for us and explore some of the practical implications of these big theological ideas. Okay, so we've laid some theological groundwork, but now I kind of want to get practical. What does this whole discussion about God and Mary and bowing actually mean for us? How do we apply these ideas to our own lives?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's easy to get lost in these abstract theological discussions. But they only really come alive, I think, when we connect them to our everyday experiences.
I'm with you there. So where do we even begin to bridge that gap?
Well, one of the most striking takeaways for me from our Daily Breads video, and I think from our conversation so far, is this concept of God's humility.
Yeah, this idea that God, in the person of Jesus, chose to empty himself, to enter into the limitations of human existence. It's pretty mind-blowing when you really stop and think about it.
Yeah. It really is, and it challenges us to rethink how we approach God, Do we come to him with this sense of entitlement, expecting him to bow to our desires? Or do we come with humility, recognizing his sovereignty and our dependence on him?
That's a really powerful question. I know I can fall into that trap of thinking God should just snap his fingers and make things happen the way I want them to.
Yeah, it's a very human tendency, isn't it? But that's not how a healthy relationship works, whether it's with God or even with other people. Just like in any relationship, there needs to be mutual respect and understanding, and even a willingness to surrender some of our own control.
Surrender control, you mean like actually letting go of the reins and trusting God to guide us?
Exactly. And that's not always easy, especially in a culture that prizes self-reliance and being in charge of your own destiny.
Yeah, it feels almost counterintuitive, doesn't it? To find freedom in surrender.
It does, but that's precisely what Mary's example shows us. She didn't try to bargain with God or dictate terms. She simply said, "I am the Lord's servant. May your word to me be fulfilled."
And in that act of surrender, she became a vessel for something so much greater than herself.
Exactly. And her story reminds us that humility and obedience aren't about passively accepting whatever comes our way. They're about actively aligning our will with God's, even when we don't fully understand his plan.
So it's not about sitting back and waiting for God to do everything. It's about actively participating in his work.
Yes. It's about seeking his guidance, listening for his voice, and then stepping out in faith, even when it feels uncertain or even scary.
Okay, that makes sense. But I have to admit, putting this into practice in daily life feels daunting. It's easy to talk about humility and obedience in the abstract, but what does it actually look like in our everyday choices and actions?
That's a great question, and it's definitely something we're going to explore further in part 3. But for now, I think it's important to just sit with this idea of surrender.
Sit with it. You mean like actually reflect on what it means to let go of our need to control everything?
Exactly. To acknowledge that we're not the center of the universe, that there's this bigger story unfolding and we have a part to play in it. But it might not always look the way we expect.
I'm starting to see how this all connects back to that initial question about God bowing to Mary. It really forces us to confront our own ideas about power and control and how we relate to God.
You've hit the nail on the head. It challenges us to shift from this mindset of demanding to a posture of surrender.
And in that surrender, we might discover a freedom and a sense of purpose that we could never have imagined on our own.
Now, that's a thought worth pondering. And speaking of pondering, I think it's time we move on to part 3 of our deep dive, where we'll explore some practical ways to apply these ideas to our everyday lives.
Okay, deep divers. So we spent the last 2 parts unpacking this big question, did God bow to Mary? And we've established that theologically the answer is a pretty clear no. But as we've been discussing, this whole deep dive has really gotten us thinking about humility and surrender and what it actually looks like to live out those ideas.
Yeah, that's where the rubber meets the road, right? It's one thing to sort of grasp these concepts intellectually, but it's another thing entirely to actually embody them in our day-to-day lives.
Totally, and I think that's what a lot of us struggle with, right? Like, how do we take these big theological ideas and actually translate them into concrete action? So let's get practical back. What does a life marked by humility and surrender actually look like?
Well, I think it starts with a willingness to let go of our ego, that constant need to be right, to be in control, to have all the answers. It's about recognizing that our way isn't always the best way, and that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is actually step aside and let God lead.
Oh man, that sounds so hard though, especially in our culture, right? Where we're constantly bombarded with these messages about achieving and striving and being the best. Humility, it almost feels countercultural, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, but that's also what makes it so radical, and I think, dare I say, liberating. It's about releasing that pressure to have it all figured out, to prove ourselves to the world. It's about finding freedom in recognizing that we're not ultimately in control.
When you put it that way, it almost sounds like a relief. Like just taking this deep breath and finally letting go of the weight of having to carry everything ourselves.
That's a great way to put it. And that's not to say it's easy. You know, there will be times when we doubt, when we question, when we want to grab those reins back. But I think in those moments, Mary's example can be incredibly inspiring.
Because she didn't have it all figured out either.
Right.
I mean, she was this young woman facing a situation that would terrified most of us, but yet she chose to trust God even when it didn't make sense.
Exactly. And that's what makes her story so relatable and so powerful. It reminds us that we don't have to be perfect or have all the answers to be used by God. He can work through our weaknesses, our doubts, even our mistakes.
So it's not about trying to become like a Mary clone, but it's about
Right.
embracing the unique way that God wants to work through us with all of our imperfections and quirks.
Precisely. And that's where I think the real beauty lies. You know, God's plan isn't this one-size-fits-all blueprint. It's this tapestry woven from the unique threads of each individual life.
Ooh. I love that analogy. That's such a beautiful way to think about how God's power operates. It's not about forcing things to happen. It's about working through relationships, through collaboration, and yes, even through surrender.
Yeah, and that's a much more nuanced and frankly more awe-inspiring view of power than the one we often see in the world, right? It's not about brute force or control. It's about love, humility, and this willingness to actually meet us where we are.
You know what? I think we've come full circle. We started with this question about whether God bowed to Mary, and we've ended up with this much richer understanding of God's power, his love for humanity, and the way he invites us to participate in his story.
And I think at the heart of it all is this central message of the Christian faith. God's love for us is so great that he was willing to humble himself to become one of us, to experience the limitations of human life, all so that we could be reconciled to him.
And Mary's story serves as such a powerful reminder that each of us has this role to play in that grand narrative. You know, it might not look as dramatic as giving birth to the Son of God, but it's no less important.
Precisely. We're all invited to participate in God's work, to be instruments of his grace, to reflect his love to the world around us.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the question we're left with isn't, did God bow to Mary? But rather, what is God calling me to do? What yes is he asking me to say?
What a powerful way to frame it. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. The invitation is there. The question is, will we, like Mary, embrace that humility and obedience that allows God to work through us in extraordinary ways?
That's something for all of us to ponder as we go about our day. Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey, Deep Divers. Until next time, keep those questions coming and keep diving deep.